topography of Bristol is defined by its hills and its history of industry, a landscape where Victorian terraces cling to steep gradients and the echoes of commerce have always been a part of the acoustic backdrop. In the late 1970s, however, a new sound emerged from the ambient clutter of the city, a noise that would eventually become a defining psychological burden for thousands of residents. This was not a singular explosive event or a momentary disruption, but rather a slow creeping invasion of the senses that transformed the sanctuary of the home into a space of relentless unease. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, around 1976, though retrospective accounts suggest it may have been present even earlier. Scattered reports began to filter into the local council offices and the letters pages of the Bristol Evening Post. At first, these complaints were dismissed as the grumblings of the hypersensitive or the elderly. The descriptions were inconsistent in their precise analogies, but uniform in their nature. People described a low, droning sound, akin to a diesel truck idling down the street. Yet, when they looked out their windows, the roads were empty. Others compared it to the distant throbbing of a factory fan or a generator running in a neighbor's basement. The anomaly was not merely that a noise existed, but that it was selective. In a household of 4, perhaps only one person would perceive it. This disparity created immediate social friction. Husbands dismissed the concerns of their wives, and parents worried about the mental state of their children, or vice versa. The phenomenon was isolating. To hear the hum was to be trapped in a private auditory enclosure where the walls offered no protection. In fact, for many, the walls made it worse. By the summer of 1977, the trickle of complaints had swollen into a torrent. The Bristol Environmental Health Department found itself besieged by calls from distressed citizens who claimed that their quality of life was eroding. The sound was constant, unyielding, and loudest at night when the masking noise of city traffic died away. It was a nocturnal intruder that disregarded earplugs, pillows, and double glazing. The specific acoustic character of the hum was what made it so insidious. It operated in the low frequency range, likely between 40 and 80 hertz. Physics dictates that low frequency sound waves travel immense distances with very little attenuation. They pass through solid structures, brick, mortar, glass, with ease. When these long waves enter a room, they can create standing waves, zones of high and low pressure that can actually amplify the sensation of the sound, depending on where a person is standing. Residents reported a bizarre phenomenon where moving their head just a few inches could change the volume from a dull murmur to an unbearable throb. The physical symptoms reported went beyond simple annoyance. The hum was felt as much as it was heard. Residents described a sensation of pressure in the ears, similar to the change in altitude during a flight, but without the relief of popping. Headaches were common, a dull ache at the base of the skull that tightened as the night wore on. Nausea, dizziness, and nosebleeds were frequently cited in the dossiers compiled by health officials. But the most devastating impact was sleep deprivation. The inability to sleep transformed reasonable, level-headed individuals into desperate insomniacs. Night after night, they would lie awake, listening to the rhythmic chugging that no one else could hear. The psychological toll was severe. Reports from the time indicate a sharp rise in prescriptions for tranquilizers and sedatives in the affected neighborhoods. People began to question their own sanity when an external reality cannot be verified by those around you. The internal reality begins to fracture. The hum forced residents to doubt their senses, creating a feedback loop of anxiety that only served to heighten their sensitivity to the noise. One particular account from a resident in the Redland area encapsulates the futility of the struggle. After weeks of sleeplessness, the individual began a systematic elimination of every electrical device in the home. The refrigerator was unplugged, the central heating disabled, the mains electricity shut off entirely at the fuse box. Sitting in the dark, in a house devoid of power, the hum remained. It was a vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, resonating through the floorboards and up through the furniture. The silence of the house only served to provide a cleaner canvas for the drone to occupy. As the months dragged on, the affected residents began to organize. They realized they were not alone when the local press finally gave the story front-page prominence. The sheer volume of response to these articles was staggering. Hundreds of letters poured in, confirming that this was a citywide phenomenon. A support group was formed, a collective of the sleepless who met to share their experiences and demand action. This marked a turning point where the hum transitioned from a series of isolated complaints into a recognized public health issue. The environmental health officers were baffled. Their equipment, standard for the era, was designed to measure industrial noise levels on the A-weighted decibel scale, which is adjusted to match the frequency response of the human ear. This scale largely filters out low-frequency sounds, meaning that when officers arrived at a complainant's home with their meters, the needle barely moved. The officials would stand in a living room, staring at a device that read silence, while the resident beside them held their head in their hands, tormented by the noise. This technological gap fueled conspiracy theories and mistrust. The residents felt abandoned by the authorities, convinced that the council was either incompetent or covering up the source. Desperation drove some to extreme measures, to escape the sound. There were reports of people sleeping in their cars, in lay-bys miles, outside the city limits, seeking a reprieve. Others sold their homes, moving to different counties, only to find that in some cases, the hum followed them, suggesting that for some, the threshold of hearing had been permanently altered, or that the sensitivity had become internalized. The source of the hum became the subject of intense speculation. The sheer range of theories reflected the anxiety of the time. Some pointed to the industrial complex at Avonmouth, miles away, suggesting that massive fans or compressors were sending low-frequency waves drifting up the river valley. Others looked to the network of high-pressure gas pipelines running beneath the city streets. More exotic theories emerged involving military communications, low-frequency submarine transmissions, or even atmospheric anomalies. One specific incident in 1978 highlighted the tangible danger of the phenomenon. A woman, exhausted and disoriented from weeks of broken sleep, was found wandering the streets in the early hours of the morning. She had left her home, unable to bear the pressure in her ears. She was not suffering from a prior mental health condition. She was simply a casualty of an environment that had become hostile to her physiology. This was not an isolated case of distress. The local hospitals saw a statistically significant uptake in admissions for stress-related ailments among the demographic reporting the noise. The scientific community began to take notice, recognizing that the Bristol hum was a perfect storm of acoustics, geography, and biology. Researchers from Chelsea College in London and other institutions arrived with more specialized equipment, spectrum analyzers capable of detecting the elusive low frequencies. They confirmed what the residents already knew. There was a noise. It was not a hallucination. The background noise of Bristol did indeed contain specific peaks at low frequencies, distinct spikes in the spectrum that could, for a sensitive ear, coalesce into a continuous tone. However, identifying the presence of the sound was only half the battle. Locating the source proved to be a labyrinthine task. Low-frequency sound is notoriously difficult to direction find. The wavelengths are so long, often several meters, that they wrap around buildings and obstacles, making it impossible to point a microphone and say, "It is coming from there." The city itself, with its valleys and gorges, acted as an acoustic lens, focusing and scattering the sound in unpredictable ways. A signal originating from an industrial fan 3 miles away could theoretically bounce off the cloud base or a thermal inversion layer and land in a quiet suburb with absolute clarity, while the areas in between heard nothing. The incident of the Bristol hum was effectively a mass exposure event to an invisible pollutant. It challenged the definition of pollution itself. If a factory emits smoke, it is visible and regulated. If it emits a high-pitched screech, it is measurable and actionable. But a low, throbbing vibration that only 2% of the population can hear sits in a regulatory gray area. The law at the time was ill-equipped to deal with subjective suffering caused by objective but elusive physics. By the end of the 1970s, the hum had cemented itself as a permanent fixture in the city's narrative. It had altered the lives of thousands, forcing a migration of sensitive individuals and leaving a legacy of distrust in official measurements. The incident revealed a fragility in the human condition, the profound reliance on silence for sanity. When that silence was taken away, not by a chaotic roar, but by a steady, unwavering mechanical pulse, the psychological impact was profound. The community remained in a state of high tension. Every new industrial development was viewed with suspicion. The hum had become a phantom presence in the city, a reminder that the industrial heartbeat of modern civilization was not compatible with everyone's biology. As the decade turned, the mystery remained unsolved, leaving the residents of Bristol to wonder if the noise would ever stop, or if they were doomed to listen to the city breathing forever. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a chronic, weary endurance. But the question of what exactly happened in the quiet hours of the night remained the darkest shadow over the city. The historic city of Bristol, in the southwest of England, is a place defined by its geography, built on rolling hills and carved by the River Avon. It is a landscape of gorges and valleys, a topography that naturally traps the air and perhaps the sound. By the late 1970s, however, the air in Bristol began to carry something other than the salt of the sea or the exhaust of traffic. It began to carry a vibration, a persistent low-frequency thrum that would come to be known as the Bristol hum. To understand the depth of this mystery, one must look past the initial reports of annoyance and delve into the anomalies that make this phenomenon so resistant to explanation. It is in the specific, peculiar details of the hum that the true unsettling nature of the case resides. The first and most significant anomaly is the selectivity of the perception. In the vast majority of environmental noise cases, a sound is an objective reality shared by anyone with functioning hearing. If a jackhammer tears into the pavement, everyone on the block winces. If a jet engine roars overhead, the conversation stops for the entire crowd. The Bristol hum refuses to adhere to this rule. It is a noise that segregates the population. Estimates suggest that only about 2% of the people living in the affected area can hear it. This creates a bizarre and isolating social dynamic. A husband might lie awake in the grip of a relentless, throbbing drone that It sounds like a diesel engine idling right against the bedroom wall, while his wife sleeps soundly beside him, enveloped in total silence. This subjectivity led many medical professionals and skeptics to immediately classify the hum as tinnitus, a condition where the ear generates its own internal ringing or buzzing. Yet this explanation fails to account for the collective consistency of the reports. Tinnitus is typically a high-pitched frequency, a sharp ring or a hiss, and it is highly individualistic. The Bristol hum, conversely, is almost universally described by those who hear it as a low-frequency rumble. The descriptions are eerily synchronized. Witnesses separated by miles, who have never met one another, describe the exact same modulation, the same rhythm, and the same mechanical texture. It is highly improbable that thousands of people would simultaneously develop the exact same unique form of low-frequency tinnitus at the exact same time in history. Furthermore, the behavior of the sound defies the logic of internal ear disorders. Tinnitus typically follows the individual regardless of their location. If a person has a ringing in their ears, they hear it in Bristol, in London, or on holiday in Spain. The Bristol hum, however, is geographically tethered. Many sufferers report that the moment they drive out of the city limits or travel a certain distance away from the Avonmouth industrial area, the noise vanishes, the silence returns, and the pressure in their head lifts. This geographical dependency strongly suggests an external source, a physical wave moving through the atmosphere. Yet, it remains invisible to the vast majority of the population. This creates a paradox where the noise acts like an external sound in terms of location, but acts like an internal hallucination in terms of perception. The second major anomaly lies in the physics of the sound itself and how it interacts with the built environment. Standard acoustic logic dictates that walls and insulation should dampen noise. If there is a loud truck outside, closing the window and drawing the curtains should muffle the sound. With the Bristol hum, the opposite is often true. Residents frequently report that the noise is significantly louder inside their homes than it is outside. When they step out into the garden to identify the source, the sound often dissipates or blends into the background ambient noise. But the moment they step back inside, the droning returns with increased intensity. Acoustic engineers explain this through a phenomenon known as the Helmholtz resonance, similar to the way air vibrates when one blows across the top of a bottle. A room can act as a resonator for low-frequency waves, amplifying a sound that is barely perceptible outdoors. While this is a scientifically valid concept, it does not explain the source of the energy exciting the room. For a room to resonate, there must be an input. Despite decades of searching, Measurements taken inside the homes of sufferers often show flat lines on the graphs. Standard audio equipment, designed to pick up the frequencies of human speech and music, often fails to register the ultra-low frequencies that characterize the hum. When more sensitive equipment is used, it sometimes detects a 30 Hz to 40 Hz signal, but often at a volume that should theoretically be below the threshold of human hearing. This implies that the people who hear the hum possess a sensory sensitivity that goes far beyond the average, or that the measurement tools are missing a critical component of the wave. The psychological and physiological impact on the hearers presents the third, and perhaps most disturbing anomaly. This is not merely a noise, it is a physical sensation. Sufferers describe a feeling of pressure, similar to the sensation of descending in an airplane. But the ears never pop to relieve the tension. This pressure is accompanied by a suite of physical symptoms that do not typically correlate with simple noise pollution. Reports of nosebleeds, severe headaches, dizziness, and a pervasive sense of imbalance are common among the group. The distress caused by this intrusion is profound. Sleep becomes impossible. The noise is described as relentless and intrusive, piercing through earplugs and burying itself deep in the skull. In the late 70s and early 80s, the tension in Bristol reached a breaking point. The local newspapers were flooded with letters from residents claiming they were losing their minds. There were tragic instances where the psychological strain became too much to bear. While we must speak carefully of such matters, it is a matter of record that several deaths in the area were attributed by coroners or family members to the unendurable torment of the noise. Individuals felt trapped in their own homes, subjected to an assault that no one else could verify, leading to a desperate sense of hopelessness. The invisibility of the antagonist made the suffering all the more acute. The search for a culprit brings us to the anomaly of the industrial suspects. The most obvious source for a low-frequency drone in Bristol is the Avonmouth Industrial Complex, a sprawling site of factories, chemical plants, and docks. Throughout the investigation, various specific machines were blamed, from cooling fans to industrial blowers. In one instance, a specific fan at a chemical plant was identified as a potential source. The plant agreed to shut down the fan for a test period. While some residents reported relief, others claimed the noise continued unabated. This inconsistency plagues every industrial explanation. If the source was a single machine, the sound should radiate out in a predictable pattern, diminishing with distance. Yet the hum appears in pockets. It skips certain streets and hits others with full force. It is heard clearly in basements and attics, but not on ground floors. The unpredictability of the sound map suggests a source that is omnipresent rather than singular. or a propagation method that utilizes the earth itself rather than the air. This leads to the more esoteric theories, which attempt to bridge the gap between the physical and the perceived. Some researchers have looked away from the factories and toward the infrastructure of the modern world. The frequency of the electricity grid in the United Kingdom is 50 hertz. It is a constant, invisible pulse that runs through the walls of every home. Is it possible that the hum is a reaction to electromagnetic fields rather than acoustic waves? This theory posits that the hearers are actually perceiving electromagnetic radiation as sound, a phenomenon known as the Frey effect. If this were true, it would explain why earplugs offer no protection and why the sound is louder indoors, where wiring surrounds the resident. However, this remains unproven and places the phenomenon on the fringe of accepted science. There is also the global context to consider. While Bristol gave the phenomenon its name, the hum is not unique to this city. Similar outbreaks have occurred in Taos, New Mexico, Kokomo, Indiana, and Windsor, Ontario. In each case, the anomalies remain consistent. The low frequency, the selective hearing, the indoor amplification, and the lack of a definitive source. In Kokomo, an investigation eventually blamed cooling fans and air compressors. Yet, even after abatement measures were taken, the complaints did not entirely cease. This suggests that while industrial noise is a contributing factor, it may trigger a sensitivity that persists even after the primary source is silenced. The final anomaly is the evolution of the hum over time. It has not remained static. In the decades since the initial surge of reports in the late 70s, the profile of the hum has shifted. It comes in waves, seemingly tied to atmospheric conditions, wind direction, or perhaps changes in industrial activity. But for the core group of hearers, it is a lifetime sentence. They have adapted their lives around a phantom noise. They sleep with radios tuned to static to mask the drone. They install triple glazing that does nothing to stop the vibration. They form support groups where the primary comfort is simply being believed. The Bristol hum represents a collision between the hard science of acoustics and the soft science of human perception. It sits in the gray area where the environment ends and the body begins. It is a reminder that our senses are not mere recorders of objective reality, but are filters. And for 2% of the population, the filter has failed, letting in the grinding, mechanical noise of the modern world. The anomalies of the hum, its selectivity, its ability to penetrate walls, and its physical toll suggest that we are dealing with a form of pollution that we do not yet have the vocabulary to fully describe. It remains a ghost in the machine of the city, a sound that is everywhere and nowhere at once. By the winter of 1979, The investigation into the phenomenon known as the Bristol hum had shifted from a local curiosity into a rigorous, albeit frustrating, pursuit of a phantom. The initial reports, scattered and easily dismissed as the complaints of the oversensitive, had coalesced into a data set that could no longer be ignored. Hundreds of letters flooded the desks of the local council and the Environmental Health Department, each describing the same auditory intruder. It was a low, steady drone, comparable to a diesel engine idling a street away, or a distant compressor that never cycled off. The noise was maddeningly persistent, yet it possessed a ghost-like quality that defied standard capture. As investigators began to peel back the layers of the city to find the source, they found themselves walking down a series of corridors that promised answers, but delivered only silence. These were the dead ends, the theories that seemed perfect on paper, but crumbled the moment they were tested against the reality of the hum. The most obvious culprit, and the first to be subjected to intense scrutiny, was the industrial complex at Avonmouth, situated to the northwest of the residential areas. Avonmouth was a dense thicket of heavy industry, home to smelting works, chemical plants, and massive ventilation systems. It was a logical assumption that the noise was simply industrial pollution drifting on the wind, a byproduct of the city's economic engine. The logic held that low-frequency sound waves, which are notorious for traveling vast distances without losing energy, were escaping from a specific fan or generator and blanketing the city. Environmental health officers launched a series of nocturnal surveys, armed with the best acoustic equipment available at the time. They set up monitoring stations in the gardens and bedrooms of the affected individuals. The expectation was that their needles would jump, registering a spike in the 40 to 80 hertz range, leading them directly to a faulty cooling tower or a misaligned turbine. Instead, the equipment remained largely unresponsive, while the residents clutched their heads in distress, describing the noise as louder than ever. The meters barely registered a whisper above the ambient floor of the night. The discrepancy was baffling to the human ear, or at least to the ears of the perceivers. The sound was oppressive. To the machine, it was non-existent. Despite the lack of recorded evidence, the pressure on the council forced a practical experiment. In an unprecedented move, cooperation was sought from several major factories in the Avonmouth zone. Arrangements were made to shut down specific high-power fans and machinery at coordinated times during the night, creating windows of artificial silence to see if the hum would vanish. Investigators and residents sat in quiet rooms, waiting for the scheduled shutdown. The machinery ground to a halt. The industrial hum of the port faded. Yet inside the homes of the afflicted, the drone persisted. Telephone lines to the council remained active with reports that the noise had not stopped, or in some confounding cases, had actually increased in intensity. The industrial theory, while geographically sound, failed to account for the ubiquity and the persistence of the phenomenon. The source was not a fan in Avonmouth. With the external mechanical sources failing to provide a solution, the investigation turned inward, pivoting toward a hypothesis that was far more controversial. If the sound could not be measured by microphones, perhaps the sound did not exist in the physical space at all. The medical community began to suggest that the Bristol hum was not a sound wave, but a symptom. The diagnosis of tinnitus was offered as a blanket explanation. Tinnitus, a condition where a person perceives ringing or buzzing in the ears without an external source, seemed to fit the lack of acoustic evidence. However, this medical dead end proved to be one of the most contentious aspects of the entire saga. The profile of the typical hum hearer did not match the clinical profile of a tinnitus patient. Tinnitus is often high-pitched, a ringing or a whistle, and is frequently associated with hearing loss. The hum, by contrast, was universally described as a low rumble. Furthermore, audiograms conducted on the sufferers often revealed perfect hearing. Perhaps the most damning evidence against the tinnitus theory was the communal nature of the experience. Tinnitus is subjective and isolated. The hum, however, was often heard by multiple people in the same household at the same time. There were accounts of visitors coming to Bristol from other cities, claiming they could hear the noise the moment they entered the affected zone, only for it to vanish when they left. A biological error in the inner ear would not be geographically constrained. The dismissal of the hum as a psychological or medical defect created a deep rift between the authorities and the public. It implied that the problem lay within the minds of the residents, a suggestion that was met with hostility and despair by those who were losing sleep night after night. Support groups formed, not to share medical tips, but to validate their own reality against a scientific establishment that was effectively telling them they were imagining the intruder. This avenue of investigation did not solve the mystery. It merely deepened the sense of isolation for those living inside it. As the medical explanation faltered, investigators looked toward the infrastructure that laced the ground beneath the city. A physicist from a local university proposed that the high-pressure gas mains might be the culprit. The theory was elegant in its physics. The gas moving through the pipes at high velocity could, under the right conditions, cause the pipes to resonate like the massive strings of a subterranean cello. This vibration would then be transmitted through the soil and into the foundations of houses, turning the walls themselves into speakers. This would explain why the sound was often described as being louder indoors than outdoors. Inside, the listener was essentially standing inside the resonance chamber. Engineers from the gas board were brought in. They examined flow rates and pressure regulators. They walked the lines with vibration sensors. While it was true that gas lines could vibrate, the frequency required to generate the specific hum reported in Bristol did not match the operational frequencies of the gas network. Furthermore, the hum was heard in areas not serviced by the high-pressure mains. Once again, a plausible theory ran aground on the rocks of inconsistency. The grid was silent, or at least innocent of this particular disturbance. Then came the theory of the electric mains. The 50 Hz cycle of the alternating current used in the national grid is audible to some, usually as a hum from a transformer or a fluorescent light. Some researchers speculated that the grid itself was interacting with the environment in a novel way, perhaps grounding through the water table or interacting with specific geological features of the Bristol Basin to amplify the 50 Hz hum into something pervasive. But frequency analysis of the hum reports showed a mismatch. The hum was often described as lower than 50 Hz, sometimes dipping into the 30 Hz range, and crucially, it often pulsed or throbbed, whereas the mains hum is constant. If the electricity grid was to blame, the entire country should have been humming, not just a specific pocket of the Southwest. Desperation led the investigation into the realm of the natural world, specifically the ocean. A phenomenon known as microseisms involves the interaction of ocean waves with the sea floor, creating seismic noise that travels through the earth. With the Bristol Channel nearby, it was suggested that the distinct geography of the region was amplifying the sound of the ocean, transmitting it through the bedrock and into the homes of the city. This theory gained traction because it explained why the sound could not be stopped. One cannot switch off the tide. However, microseisms are generally far below the threshold of human hearing, existing as vibrations rather than audible tones. For the ocean theory to hold, there had to be a mechanism that converted these seismic tremors into airborne sound within the bedrooms of Bristol. While theoretically possible through a process called structural acoustic coupling, the energy levels required were immense. The ground would have to be shaking significantly enough to turn a house into a loudspeaker, a level of vibration that would have been detected by even the most rudimentary seismograph. The seismographs, like the microphones before them, showed nothing unusual. The earth was stable. The ocean was behaving normally. By the early 1980s, the investigation had exhausted the likely, the plausible, and the obscure. The industrial fans were exonerated, the gas pipes cleared, the power lines dismissed, and the ocean ruled out. the medical professionals had retreated, unable to cure a condition that didn't fit their books, and the acoustic engineers packed up their equipment, leaving behind a silence on their tapes that contradicted the noise in the residents' ears. This phase of the mystery was defined not by what was found, but by what was not. It was a process of elimination that eliminated everything. The dead ends were not merely failures of investigation. They were solid walls that the community had been thrown against, again and again. Each new theory brought a spark of hope that if the source could be named, it could be silenced. And each debunking extinguished that hope, leaving the affected individuals to face another night of the drone with no explanation and no recourse. The failure to pin the hum on a physical source within the city limits forced a disturbing realization. If the sound was not coming from the factories, the ground, or the infrastructure, and if it was not a hallucination, then the parameters of the search were wrong. The investigators had been looking for a local cause for a local problem. But as the letters continued to arrive, and as the reports began to trickle in from other towns and other countries, it became clear that the Bristol hum might not be about Bristol at all. The dead ends within the city pointed to the possibility that the source was something far more vast, or perhaps something fundamental to the way the modern world was being constructed. The investigation had to stop looking at the map of the city and start looking at the map of the atmosphere, or perhaps the limitations of human perception itself. The answers were not in the geography of the Avon, and the silence of the instruments was the loudest clue of all. The conventional search was over. The anomaly remained. The city of Bristol sits in the southwest of England, defined by its rolling hills, the dramatic gorge cut by the river Avon, and a history steeped in maritime trade and heavy industry. By day, it is a bustling hub of commerce and culture, a place of vibrant noises ranging from traffic to the chatter of pedestrians. But when the sun sets and the typical din of the city fades into the silence of the night, something else reportedly takes its place. For a select group of residents beginning in the late 1970s, the silence was not silent at all. It was occupied by a low, persistent drone that came to be known as the Bristol hum. This was not a loud noise in the traditional sense, but rather a sensation of sound, a pervasive vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly within the skull. To understand the phenomenon, one must first understand the isolation it created. Imagine lying in bed, waiting for sleep, only to hear the distant idle of a diesel truck engine. You wait for the driver to cut the ignition, but the engine runs on. You get up, walk to the window, and look out onto the street. The road is empty. The night is still. You close the window, but the sound remains. You cover your ears, pressing your palms tight against your head. Yet the drone persists, unaffected by physical barriers. This was the reality for hundreds of people in Bristol, a reality that slowly eroded their peace of mind and, in some cases, their sanity. The first major wave of reports surfaced around 1976 and 1977. Letters began to arrive at the offices of the local newspaper, the Bristol Evening Post. At first, they were sporadic, singular complaints about noise pollution. Writers described a low-frequency hum, often comparing it to a distant factory fan or a generator running nearby. However, as the letters were published, a strange pattern emerged. The writers were scattered across the city, often miles apart, yet their descriptions were eerily identical. They spoke of a noise that was audible only indoors, a sound that became louder at night, and most frustratingly, a sound that their spouses or neighbors often could not hear at all. This generated a specific kind of psychological pressure. When a person hears a sound that no one else can perceive, the immediate assumption is often that the problem lies within the individual rather than the environment. It casts doubt on one's own perception of reality. Yet, as the number of accounts grew into the hundreds, it became clear that this was not a case of individual delusion. It was a shared experience, a collective anomaly that demanded an explanation. By 1979, the issue had gained enough traction to warrant official attention. The Environmental Health Department found itself besieged by calls. Acoustic experts and engineers were dispatched to various homes to measure the noise levels. This is where the investigation encountered its most significant hurdle. The human ear is capable of detecting a vast range of frequencies, but standard audio equipment at the time was calibrated to detect noises that fall within the typical range of human conversation and industrial clamor. The hum, however, sat on the very edge of perception. It was described as a low-frequency sound, hovering around the threshold of human hearing, perhaps between 30 and 40 hertz. Low-frequency waves behave differently than higher-pitched sounds. They have long wavelengths that can travel vast distances without losing energy. They can pass through walls, windows, and solid brick with ease. In fact, solid structures can sometimes amplify these waves, turning a room into a resonance chamber. This explained why the hum was often louder inside the home than outside on the street. Despite the logic of low-frequency physics, the equipment often failed to register what the residents were hearing. Engineers would stand in a quiet bedroom, meters in hand, watching needles that refused to move, while the person living there sat on the edge of the bed in tears, describing a noise that felt like pressure building behind their eyes. This discrepancy between the measured reality and the perceived reality created a friction between the authorities and the sufferers. The officials wanted hard data, while the residents just wanted the noise to stop. Theories began to proliferate, ranging from the plausible to the paranoid. The most immediate culprit was the industrial complex at Avonmouth, located to the northwest of the city. Avonmouth was home to chemical plants, smelting works, and heavy machinery. It was hypothesized that a specific piece of equipment, perhaps a large industrial fan or a compressor, was generating a specific frequency that drifted over the hills and settled into the pockets of the city. In an attempt to isolate the source, experiments were conducted. In one instance, factories in the industrial zone agreed to shut down specific machinery at coordinated times to see if the hum would cease. Residents were asked to log when they heard the noise stop. While some correlations were found, there was never a definitive moment where the silence returned for everyone. The signal was elusive. It would fade for one person while continuing for another just a few streets away. This inconsistency led some researchers to look away from the factories and toward the infrastructure of the city itself. High-pressure gas mains were scrutinized, as the flow of gas through pipes can generate low-frequency vibrations. The electrical grid was also considered, with the 50 Hz hum of the mains electricity being a prime suspect. Yet nothing offered a complete explanation. The hum seemed to be a ghost in the machine of the modern city, a byproduct of civilization that could not be pinned down to a single origin. As the months turned into years, the human toll became the central story of the Bristol hum. The inability to escape the noise led to chronic insomnia for many. Sleep deprivation is a powerful solvent of mental health. It strips away resilience, leaving people irritable, anxious, and desperate. Medical records from the time show an uptick in prescriptions for sedatives and tranquilizers among those who identified as hearers. The hum was not just a nuisance, it was a health crisis. Support groups were formed, providing a space where sufferers could meet and validate each other's experiences. In these meetings, the isolation was temporarily lifted. They shared tips on how to mask the sound, discussing the merits of playing soft radio static or using ticking clocks to disrupt the monotony of the drone. But underneath the camaraderie was a shared fear that the sound would never leave. There were tragic instances where the despair led to a final, permanent decision. Cases where the loss of life was attributed to the unbearable nature of the constant noise. These events cast a somber shadow over the investigation, transforming it from a curiosity into a matter of life and death. The scientific community eventually offered a hypothesis that divided the hearers. They suggested that the hum might be a result of the interactions between the modern environment and the aging human ear. As people age, their hearing naturally deteriorates, usually losing the ability to hear high frequencies first. However, in some cases, the ear can become hypersensitive to low frequencies. Furthermore, a condition known as spontaneous autocaustic emissions involves the ear actually generating its own sounds. The hair cells inside the cochlea can vibrate, producing a faint noise that the brain interprets as external sound. If a person focuses on this sound in a quiet room, the brain can amplify it, creating a feedback loop. This theory posits that the hum is real, but it is internal, a phantom signal generated by the biology of the listener. For many sufferers, this explanation was offensive. It felt like a dismissal, a way for the authorities to wash their hands of the problem by labeling it a medical issue rather than an environmental one. They pointed to the fact that they could block the sound by leaving the city. If the sound was in their heads, why did it vanish when they traveled 30 miles away? This geographical component remains one of the strongest arguments against the purely internal theory. Many residents reported that a weekend trip to the coast or a drive into the countryside provided instant relief. The silence would return, deep and true, only to be shattered the moment they crossed back into the city limits. This suggests that there was indeed an external stimulus, an environmental trigger that interacted with specific individuals who had a sensitivity to that frequency. It paints a picture of a city immersed in an invisible ocean of noise, a smog of sound waves that most people are lucky enough to be deaf to. The geography of Bristol, with its hills and valleys, may have acted as an acoustic lens, focusing these waves into specific neighborhoods, creating hot spots of high intensity. By the early 1980s, the intensity of the reports began to wane. Whether this was because the industrial source was quietly altered, or because the people simply learned to live with the intrusion, is unclear. The media moved on to other stories, and the public interest faded. However, the hum did not disappear. To this day, there are those in Bristol who hear the drone. It has become a part of the city's folklore, a lingering signal that serves as a reminder of the limits of our perception. It challenges the assumption that we all inhabit the same sensory world. For the hearers, the city is a different place, one that vibrates with a secret energy. The mystery of the Bristol hum remains unsolved, leaving behind a legacy of unease. It suggests that in our quest to build a modern, industrial world, we may have inadvertently created phenomena that we can neither control nor fully understand. We have filled the silence with 1,000 humming machines, and for some, the silence has never returned. The signal lingers, a low, steady testament to the invisible forces that surround us, waiting for the moment when the rest of the world quiets down enough for us to hear them.